to talk about the future of indoor environments, but before we do that, I want to pass it off to Drew to start, and pass to Chris after to talk about just a little bit about who they are, what their background is, and then the idea is to have this be an open conversation, so you don't need to wait to the end. If you guys have a question about anything we're discussing, just please raise your hand and ask, and want this to be casual and informative. So Drew, pass to you to start.
Cool. So the 2-minute version. My name is Drew DePriest. I currently work at Aon, we're a global professional services firm with offices in many, many countries. 500 offices globally, 50,000 employees. It's a big space. There, my very wordy title basically means that I and my team are responsible for anything that encourages collaboration throughout the office. So it's very much the intersection of the physical space, of anywhere where more than one person can sit and do something collaborative, and how that ties with the software that powers them to do it. Effectively means we have a ton of work, so I keep people like Trinetti here in the second row super, super busy all the time. The two of us just got back from opening our largest office in North America in probably 20 years. So if either of us look a little dazed, I don't think anyone's I've had 2 days off in 4 weeks, and Trinity's not too far behind. Prior to Aon, I spent 2 years at a startup called Comfy, which in my 14-year career, to me, is still the most innovative thing I think I've ever seen in the building space. Comfy, effectively, aside from making really cool, fashionable socks that say Comfy on them, is an app for your phone that allows anyone to control their entire environment. Our job was to connect people to the space. So if you're too hot or cold, press a button, the space responds within 20 seconds, and then learns everyone's preference and just automatically tunes it in time. It got into lighting, it got into service requests, conference room booking, everything. Prior to that, I was 12 years in the building automation and controls world. So if any of you have been yelling at your controls contractors, I feel their pain.
Thank you, Drew.
Yep.
And Chris?
Hey, I'm Chris Trinetti. I am CEO of Atmos. I'll take a reverse order. So I actually started out in investment banking, and that kind of illuminated a lot for me as far as workplace environments and management styles. And I got into, made an intentional move to technology, and that took me down a pretty deep rabbit hole, which I'm glad I'm sitting underground now. But so my most recent work was with QTS data centers. So I was in strategizing on cloud and data center strategies. So helping companies transition to the cloud or complex data center migrations. And then I left that to start something of my own called Atmos, which is a spatial science consortium in the West Loop of Chicago. So we've partnered up with Salt Flats and a sensor tech company called Scanalytics, and our goal is to use all of the emerging technology applied to the physical environment and help optimize businesses, work, life, just the way that we live our lives. So I'd say my overarching theme of all the work that I do is trying to find that elegant blend between the physical and the virtual.
Can you talk a little about what Scanalytics does? I think it's interesting for this conversation as well.
Yeah. So Scanalytics, and Joe is actually preparing, the founder of Scanalytics is preparing for a TED Talk right now. But he's a brainiac, he's a neuroscience background, but basically Scanalytics creates very, like almost paper thin material that layers under floors, rugs, or any surface that we stand on. So we spend 90% of our lives inside, and yet we don't really know what to do with the space. So what Scanalytics does is they produce these films that can just roll out and cut based on the square footage of a space, and they can monitor pretty much anything that sensor technology can monitor. So, but primarily movement. They work with a wide range of organizations, but any organization that cares what traffic is like within their space, that is a solution that they can provide. So and I would say just for what we're doing, sensor technology is really at the forefront of interest for us, and understanding, not only what we're doing inside, but how we're utilizing that space, and then how to take that and help us better accomplish whatever we're there to do.
So, starting this off, I want to talk a little bit about how has space changed, over the last 10 years to today. Specifically, how are we catering towards, millennials? I mean, for example, right now, the biggest difference I see is millennials today are more concerned about, what does the collaboration, in their company look like? How can they be more empowered? And, what are the fringe benefits? When they walk in, millennials are more concerned with not dollars, but how can they be in a space like a WeWork, for example, and actually have some of the creative things, like they can go do yoga in the afternoon, or they can actually have some free time that isn't just behind a typical cube farm. So, Drew, I'll pass to you to start. You've seen a lot of this.
Sure, and I have. The one comment I'd make at the start is to caution to not just couch this discussion around millennials. The space that we are working with at Aon, we're a giant financial services firm where people are deeply rooted in specific ways of working. And as we try to start looking at moving them more towards agile, it applies everywhere. Certainly, looking at data and rise in workforce, millennials are, I think, now the largest share of that. But walking around our new space last week, we've built out a lot of those collaborative spaces that are in that same vein now. So if you think about the open, the agile workplace plan that has caught a lot of heat. Lately, there's been a British report that came out in July that was not thrilled with overall productivity hit from moving to agile. But if you include with that spaces like phone booths or huddle rooms, or just kind of open spaces throughout the entire floor, I saw it was every age range, every employee type in the last couple weeks in our new office. They're using the space as it's intended to. So what we're seeing, and we hear a lot about the rise of co-working and gig economy and how it's kind of pushing people more remotely. I think there's still going to be a large contingent of people that need to be in the same space physically together to get things done. If that's salespeople, if that's creative types, they will have to be together. So to do that, you have to give them a dynamic workplace effectively. So people are going to have certain modes throughout the day. I think it was Eric was talking about buildings being dynamic. So you need to, not only from a temperature and comfort cycle, but just the way that people work throughout the day. There will be times where you need to be at your workstation, heads down for an hour, and you just plug in your headphones and you block the world out and crank out a spreadsheet. There will be times when you need to be with 3 other people with a whiteboard and maybe something on the screen. That impacts the elements of space that you have to put out there. So it's the way that we're seeing space kind of evolve has finally caught up to how people react. There's research, in addition to the WELL standard, Harvard has come out in the last 3 years, closely connecting how we operate buildings to go after human health and wellness first. So I think that as an overarching thing is great to see driving every generation. Millennials are looking more for what can I do for my mobile app. Though to be fair, our non-millennial leader in New York last week, first question she had was, how do I get this new mobile app to help me find my way around the office? So it's, you'd be surprised as to how technology is persevering. But it's an exciting time right now.
Is Aon going to a direction that you think is like, for example, here in the West Loop, Google has done a good job of keeping people in the space. They've given them food. They've given them every single, kind of, asset under the sun to do, to eat, to be healthy, to communicate, to enjoy themselves. Is Aon going that direction in some capacities?
I don't think we'll ever get to the Google side of things.
No, and that's
on that scale.
No, and that's the kind of high bar. But you guys were cube farms, 10 years ago. So
yeah. So to the extent that people still want and desire to be in a place with other people, then yes, the office needs to be conducive and invite that to happen. So there's a big element of connectivity that, in my experience, I worked remotely for 4 years. I spent those last 2 out of a WeWork space here in Chicago. And just having that element of being around people, even though I didn't work with them, was so much more healthy than working from home, let alone the fact that my 2-year-old would run in and interrupt every single phone call. So it's, I think it's a cultural difference across different companies. You know, certainly you've got your tech companies where it's come in and have your avocado toast and do goat yoga and then go home, or stay for 14 hours and just continue to persevere. But I think there are different elements and flavors of that. We are trying to keep people as accommodated as possible while they're in the office.
Chris?
Yeah, no, that you touched on a lot of great points. I have some healthy contention around, I'm obviously a millennial, so I agree and disagree to an extent. So at first I agree that we do, and we as in all of us here, regardless of your age, we do need diversified space, and I think that's the most, for me, what hit home is, I think we've seen a pendulum shift or swing in the direction of co-working, in the direction of flexible office space. And what a lot of employers see is, oh, they love snacks, they love all of these amenities. So we almost have this superficial swing towards now companies like, oh, we'll just throw in a ping pong table, or we'll say, hey, you can work remote two times a day, or 2 times a week, 2 days a week. So I think the question that we should be asking instead is, and this is what I'm really passionate about, is, well, how can we show employee engagement, or what activities or what working styles or what interior designs foster employee engagement? Because open layouts, which is it now represents most of our layouts for organizations, are actually pretty distracting and noisy. And humans, we're interesting creatures because we're, on one hand, we're really social, right? We want to be in environments like this talking to people. But then on the other spectrum, we like to have our own space. And when we want to be alone and not talk to anyone and do our autonomous work, that's what we want to do. So when I look at a McDonald's campus, it's interesting to me because as I build out my team, I think about, well, what do I want? And when you have statistics facing you, like we've never been more or less engaged, over half of our full-time working force they would say that they're not engaged and they're looking for jobs elsewhere. That's a problem, and I think that problem stems from our incentives for why we decide, if we're just putting in a ping pong table, well, that doesn't really reflect on your company. So you might get them in the door, but then they'll be there and they'll be looking for another job. So yeah, I'm excited about the future of space because we're now just starting to understand it internally, of how we can empower employees. Because then you also have to think about that, you and me, we work differently, right? I might not like the way that you want to work, but I, as a leader, should empower you to work in the way that's in accordance with that. And then look at options from there of layouts or co-working or certain settings that might empower you to do your best.
So, I mean, in today's a perfect example. So today, a report came out, WeWork is now doing work for UBS. So UBS is essentially going to be a WeWork, but under their company's platform. They did the same thing in Chicago with Expedia. Do you see that trend remaining, where they're going to go, PwC is going to become, a WeWork, or do you see that being something that's a fad and just, staying for a few years, and then we're going to go back to something else? What's your thoughts on how that's kind of playing out?
Yeah, I think it's smart, and I think Danielle touched on this earlier when you look at WeWork as an organization. Well, I think you might think of them as co-working. I think of them as this super efficient developer, this real estate company. They're really they've kind of hacked the system on how to negotiate leases and then come in there and build out these beautiful spaces that are actually cheaper than regular offices to create. And they've done this so efficiently. So I think that that trend will remain, where companies are going to say, hey, this is what you do now, and this is your benefit. But then I hope that they kind of, and you start to see it, is how can you, if you have a flexible office space is in nature flexible. It's going to be temporary. So how can WeWork help inform their members, or maybe if you have a 20-person company there, or 2-woman development team, how can you say, hey, while you're here, it might be for 6 months, it might be for 2 years, but we've learned this about your employees and their use of the space. If you can, you can put an IoT device in a table, but great, you can monitor movement in a way, or under the floors. But how can you take that and say, no, actually the amount of times that they're getting up from the table, that's directly correlated to your turnover rate. And you can say, we know that with, go to managers and say, this person has a high probability of leaving within the next month. Those are the type of granular analyses that we're able to collect, and now it's a matter of empowering WeWork and other companies that are in a position to do so to help businesses optimize their performance.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a good use case. I've been to probably 10 to 15 WeWorks in the last couple of years. You can kind of tell, we've been talking in the CRE technology space for a long time about you treat the workplace as a product of sorts. Your employees or your clients, acting in service of them. And that's how we kind of look at it internally at Aon, is that if our team does our job really well, then all of our Aon colleagues around the world do their jobs better and serve their clients better. It kind of rolls, cascades that way. WeWork, of what I've seen, has taken that to an extreme that they literally have sensors all over the place. And then they iterate every new space that they build out. So if you go to WeWork National Building, and then you go to, compare that to WeWork, I think it's South Bay in Boston, and then compare that to New City Center in Oakland, and there's one in Seattle I was at last year as well. You can kind of see little nuanced differences of where they've learned each time, like ratios on how many phone booths to put in the hot desking areas, or where do you put the outlet in a phone booth? Is it above the desk, which is the right answer? Is it below the desk, which is hard to get to? And it's little, like, nuanced things that after you see a bunch of them, it kind of feels like, all right, well, that was version 1.2, this is version 1.7, that's version 4, and it all continues to evolve. There are a handful of my former colleagues at Comfy who ended up at WeWork, and we catch up all the time. And that's kind of what they're talking about as well, is that model is, it's treated like a packaged product, and for a certain size company, yeah, that makes absolute sense of, can you help us out and make this an experience that they might not have the capacity to take on themselves internally.
And because it's a product, you're not paying, they view it as, well, now, as if you're Expedia, you're not paying the extra consulting fees. It's all right in front of you. This is your design. And they're going to be a competitor to the construction space in some capacities, because now they're actually building some of those in-house, kind of pieces to the business. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about data. So one thing I always get is, who owns the data in these spaces? I mean, you worked for for Comfy for years. How does that whether it's WeWork or whether it's Comfy, how does that kind of get put out there? Because data is very valuable, and who owns that data is such a big component of this, especially with the indoor space.
It is. It's a tricky thing, and it depends on the extent of data that you're capturing, and if it gets into personally identifying information, or PII, which is always a fun thing to bring into these kinds of conversations. If it's purely just space analysis and everything gets anonymized, that gets couched in this sort of bucket. It may or may not, especially now with things like GDPR that are out that really put legal regulations around what you can do with these things. What I've seen a lot of people buy into is the concept of the things that you measure, as long as they get anonymized, most people don't seem to care so much. It's when you get into, is this associating with my name, with my email address, then that becomes a big deal. So for a lot of these, the newer technologies that have to physically know where you are throughout the space, there are people that take issue with that. I would talk to people all the time over the last couple of years who were leveraging beacons throughout their office space. So a beacon that could passively recognize, so a beacon is Bluetooth low energy, little chip that talks to your phone without you really knowing about it. If you are a Verizon customer and you walk by a Verizon store and it automatically buzzes and says, hey, you should come inside, like, how did that happen? Beacons or geofencing. People are putting that in the workplace, so it can kind of track how you're moving around the space and make a recommendation for where you are. The data behind that, again, if it's not capturing personal data, that generally gets anonymized for a statistical thing. It generally seems to have been okay. Things I've seen in the past, it's when you start getting into, all right, this app knows who I am, it knows the department that I work in, it knows my email address, and now it wants to track or observe, is the nicer way to put it, what I'm doing throughout the space. That's when people really dig into, let's make sure that we're treating this with the proper caution. Some of the things Danielle was talking about earlier around data privacy and stuff getting in the wrong hands is very sensitive these days.
Chris?
Yeah, and I think that's when you said, collect data versus observe, a lot of it is from the standpoint of the consumer, right? Because right now, pretty much for generally speaking, just us living our normal lives, most of these applications are being used from us as consumers. But we're also employees or employers, we're children or parents or educators. So I think it's when you think about collecting data, right now it's pretty, I say it's non-altruistic in a way, because it's facilitating more demand. It's facilitating our demand in consumer products, which to an extent is okay, because even the other day I was scrolling on Instagram and there was a Banana Republic ad, and I haven't been in there in years, but it was for some cool pants, and I was like, I would look at those. But I was like, this is them doing their job. I like that. It was a very like right fit ad. So what if you could take that, from like a psychology standpoint, what if you could take that application and say, well, how can we use tech to make you a more effective leader? And then that translates, that flows upwards, and then you make your employees more empowered. And I keep going back to employees because I do think, we've seen a graph today about the slowing in productivity in the United States. And that's a serious issue. So I think that as these landscapes so dramatically change, and why I kind of disagree with millennials is that millennials have pioneered the share economy, the gig economy. So as millennials continue to basically set the stage for the future of work, well, we need to change our workplace, and dramatically. So I think the overarching theme for me, in addition to bridging the virtual and physical, is also that we just know absolutely nothing. Whether you're a contractor, whether you're a commercial real estate company like Jones Lang LaSalle, which actually does a great job with innovation, I think we should all say we don't really know. And it's changing at such a rapid pace that what we know now is still just a best guess. So as we're able to gather more data, these best guesses will be intelligent observations hopefully to a large degree.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too, like JL's doing it, Cushman's doing it, now people see young startup companies that are adding to a better indoor environment, and now they've got venture arms that are investing in those companies so they can actually own those different products that can help you move forward, can help them have an edge. But like you said, everyone's trying to figure it out. That's why they're investing in those different companies. What are some specific drivers, like what's next that you see that we haven't talked on, that you can see in kind of the indoor space? I mean, personally, one thing I saw recently, there's a company out of Germany called Airlight, and they've actually built a paint product that when you use their paint, it actually makes the air quality better in the space that you're in. I don't know how they did that or put it together, but in a very short period of time, they've gained a ton of traction because they made the environment safer when they use their paint. But what are some things that you guys have seen that are going to kind of change the work environment in the future?
Wow,
yeah.
That's a big one. How much time do we have?
No, just like more specific ones. Like what is a couple just like specific products or things that you can see, not just high level, but a couple specific things that you could see that are going to change immediately in the next few years?
So the ones that get me excited, and not necessarily from a specific perspective, but we all talk about measuring or observing things and putting that into some sort of an analytics platform that you can historically learn from how people use space. I am much more excited by things that there's a very nuanced difference between being able to predict something and being able to anticipate a human behavior. So this collective system, and again, this is very macro and not addressing the question you asked whatsoever.
It's okay.
You want
it's
micro,
the conversation.
I'm up here.
That's all right.
getting to a place where through all these data sets, there's some element of statistical analysis automatically happening in the background that knows when somebody walks into the building. And the edge that was talked about earlier kind of gets up to the edge, no pun intended, of what that can do. So they track everything. The edge knows when you pull up to the front security gate, it scans your license plate and tells you where to park. In theory, it then calls the elevator, it knows what floor you're on, and takes you straight up. So it kind of reacts. I think what we're going to see eventually, if this is 5 years or 10 years, and it's everybody's vision video right now. JLL's vision video says this, a handful of others do as well. The building knows who you are and responds to you. So the concept of like Alexa learning your preferences or your Nest learning your comfort profile, the whole building's gonna do the entire thing when you walk in. That is not a specific use case example, but from a high level, that's where it's going, I hope.
You, me both. So, Chris?
All right, I'll answer your question, and then I'm also going to go much higher level.
Nice.
All right, so one technology application that's like easy to digest. It's this company called Proxfinity. So they're a local Chicago company. Yep. Yeah, you know. So they've created a tech that enhances the way that we network. One of my goals is to get rid of the word networking. I think it's stupid. I think it's just artificial. And it's not the way that you truly connect with someone. You just, here's my business card, and then we're just going to go our separate ways. You usually don't follow through on that. So what Proxfinity does is if you and I walk past each other at a networking event, our initials would light up if we have something in common. And depending on the color, and this is all pre-entered, like pre-event, so depending on the color, we would know that, oh my gosh, we both love to play chess. So then we would just talk about chess. And what they find is those connections on what they're connecting to personally, that actually is, people are speaking to each other longer, for longer periods, and they're actually connecting outside of that event. So the interesting use case with that is, things that she can, Lisa, the founder, shows that her events with Proxfinity Tech is 300% more efficient than baseline networking events. And on top of that, you can track which vendors you went to. So when you're looking back, and even if I'm just standing in front of you, it's going to say you're probably talking or something weird is happening. But it assumes that you're not having a random staring contest with someone. So that tech is interesting to me, but taking that a step further, I personally am interested in the internet of socialization. I think that humans, and I said this before, but we're social creatures, and that's not going to change. For the last several 100,000 years, we've managed to be here right now with cameras and all this stuff because we got together and we collaborated on ideas. And now the way we collaborate is being dramatically changed, and you see it. I think that social media right now is in a pre-GMO stage, where right now social media is like GMOs. And then there was once we were able to understand about the pesticides we're using and what we are doing to produce products that we consume, we were say, hey, that's not great. That's not great to put in our bodies. And now we're in this social media pendulum where it's starting to stall a little bit. And you see that with social media users. So 2016 was the first major year that dipped a little bit. So the tech that I'm interested in is how can we almost foster serendipity. And serendipitous connections are becoming increasingly difficult to come by, right? You're walking down the street. If you see someone wearing a T-shirt of your, whatever your favorite show, you might say something. But if you're looking down, you're not. So it's how can we elegantly integrate tech behind the scenes so that it's only enhancing our personal and professional goals. And it's helping me that if in this whole room right now, that there's maybe 5 of you that we would hit it off extremely well, whether it's personally and professionally. How can we use technology to learn about us in a way that it's only enhancing? And right now we only have it pushing products on us. And I think of a world where it's pushing us to be better individuals and using it in the best way that we can, in the way that's intended to.
Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I would really. I talked about this this idea of the way we inhabit our environment being intuitive and participatory, and you touched on it a little bit already.
Yeah.
That, something that I think about a lot right now, I'm really curious to get your thoughts are, is the tension between, I work with a lot of designers who would completely reject the use of tech in the complete context of your conversation so far to participate in the environment. Everything should be self-evident through physical design, and technology should not be required because it's so self-evident through physical design that technology is not required. I don't believe in that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a role for both. And I think we're still very much figuring out what that role is, and I'm curious for both of your thoughts on that.
That's a very good question. I think that gets to the concept of, to me, not doing technology for technology's sake. Like, not let's design a new space and just pump as much brand new cool stuff in here as we can. It has to fit. Jacob Morgan talks about people, place, and technology as kind of the three pillars of workplace. So they all have to fit. So yes, there will be cases where intelligent architectural and interior design might not need to be enhanced by technology. You know, we have some spaces now that we're building that are intentionally zero technology zones. It specifically is 6 comfortable chairs in a circle, and the way that CRE explained it to me is, this is where you come in and you sit down and you talk business. We want no distractions. So I would agree that there's a fine balance between no technology and everything. It all has to be flexible.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be key to creating these types of experiences, is creating such, whether it's a retail experience or you're dining, in that it feels right. You want to promote. I think also you have to partner with people that are values oriented. So if you're a restaurant and you want people to not be on their phones, and I think you use technology in a way that they don't want to be on their phones at that. There's nothing for them there that is better in real life. So it's going to be a lot of experimentation, which is going to be the big mound to get over for these companies, is that it's going to take a lot of capital investment. It's going to take a lot of long-term investment. And when you look at companies that are doing it, I mean, you really have 2 pioneers, and they're on opposite sides of the world. You have Amazon, Alibaba, and they're doing, or Alibaba. It's my Midwestern twang coming in. You have these companies who are so long-term focused that those are the organizations that are going to, they can take a $300 million bet if they change the world. If they have a $40 billion outcome. So it's, unfortunately, there's a lot of barriers to entry, but yeah, I don't know. I'm excited for this blurring of our virtual physical worlds that it can only be accomplished by, in my opinion, and like you said, values-oriented people who are focused on the outcome of that, the use case. Why are they using that tech versus let's just throw a bunch of sensors in this room and
Call it a day.
Yeah, call it. Then we're done.
I mean, for us, like BuiltWorlds, we run a community that's based on teaching people all about all types of education from start to finish. And I think with anybody, it's try something new that, if you don't use any technology, don't try the latest augmented reality technology. But if you want to just take the right next step and just try new things. I mean, the best thing I tell people is understand what's out there and try something that is new, maybe a little outside your comfort zone, but that's going to take you a long way. Do we have any other questions?
I have sort of a question comment. Not living in a commercial building with open space, but having millennials as children and friends. Some of them hate it. And if I were in an open space, because of my personality style, socially, I'm very socially driven, but pretty ADD, so I need my quiet time space. And we recently had a speaker at a corporate event where he had to go into to a corporation where they're having difficulty. It's completely open. And there were times when people had to really focus on their project. But how do you focus on a project when you're so open? And so it created this like little red flag. And they put the red flag on the desk, and that means don't disturb me. When the red flag goes down, now you can talk to me because I don't have to focus anymore. So do they ever consider a space for personality styles where you have a quadrant of, if you're this, you could probably fit better there, but if you're that, you'd probably fit better there. You know, there's a book that I used to read when my kids are smaller, so it's titled The Way They Learn. Phenomenal book. And so it talks about the learning styles of children, but the learning styles of children become our working styles, I think, as adults. And has anyone ever researched that?
Yes. Who's going to get there first? So the way that our teams look at that and working with various vendor partners is to identify up front, we have 5 different sets of personas, so learning styles, but from a work perspective. And just from doing user research and user feedback, like actually talking to people, not just sitting up in Aeon Center, like, I wonder how they work. We should build a space for them. But actually talking to these people and conducting interviews and finding out, well, okay, well, salespeople generally want these things in life. Sometimes they need to be focused. Other times they need to be in a big giant room that's flashy and fancy and can help close deals. Or you've got creatives or developers or knowledge workers, these different types of people. And then the challenge becomes, to your point, how do you build space that accommodates, everybody needs a workstation. Like everybody needs their own little home, but instead of either raising a flag, I know people who will put in headphones even though nothing's playing or it's not even connected to your phone, and I'm guilty of that sometimes myself. Like that is the universal red flag, don't talk to me, I'm listening to something. So if you have space that is conducive to those things, so our latest office design includes neighborhoods, which is an industry broad thing of you take a unit of a business and you put them kind of in the same area, and they've all got their workstations in the middle, and then you put little quiet spaces, like a 1-seat phone booth that acoustically you can't really hear outside of. So if you need to go sit and have a phone call, you can go do it and not bother anyone. We have some quiet areas. It's just a big long bench as well with outlets and USB ports everywhere. So understood rule from an etiquette perspective is if you need to be quiet and be focused, this is where you sit and no one else will talk. So it kind of very much agree that that is the way it has to be. Not every office does it. So I think a lot of the flack we hear about the open office being loud and noisy don't have those other spaces where people can explore and be focused when they need to.
I agree. Concur.
With you. There's another question. I mean, right now we're at 4:50, so thank you, Cyclone Energy for having us, and appreciate it. Yeah.